We're very privileged to have with us this evening a very recognizable figure in the media and business world. Steve Forbes is, of course, editor-in-chief of Forbes magazine, the nation's leading business magazine, and he has headed a media company that includes not only Asian and European editions, but a number of web properties focused on politics, sports, and financial markets. Many of you will also remember Steve's spirited campaigns for the Republican presidential nomination in 1996 and 2000, during which he promoted the idea of, among other things, a flat tax, along with a new Social Security system, medical savings account, term limits, and a strong national defense. This evening, Steve comes to us as an author, which also is not a new role for him. He's written or co-written 5 previous books. His 6th and latest one, Money, How the Destruction of the Dollar Threatens the Global Economy and What We Can Do About It, is every bit as emphatic, reasoned, and clearly written as the earlier works. Anyone familiar with his free market libertarian views will not be surprised to read his criticisms of central banks and existing monetary policies. With the Fed now winding down its quantitative easing, Steve sees an especially opportune moment to rethink our monetary system and ensure a more sound and stable currency by returning to the gold standard. He writes in the book, quote, "Freeing the dollars from gold was supposed to make the United States stronger. Instead, it has made the country weaker. Something has to be done." Ladies and gentlemen, here to explain what needs to be done, along with Steve's co-author, Elizabeth Ames, who is a communications executive, is Steve Forbes.
Well, thank you very much, Brad, and thank all of you for coming out. As Brad indicated, the book is about money, monetary policy, and money, and particularly monetary policy, is one of those topics that seems to intimidate a lot of people for some strange reason. And as a result, the Federal Reserve, for example, has less formal oversight from Capitol Hill, from Congress, than do our intelligence agencies. And the thesis of this book is that, one, the topic of money is very straightforward and simple. Even though it's shrouded in a lot of jargon, a lot of equations, the idea of money is very basic. We've gotten away from it. And our policymakers today know less about money, monetary policy, than they did 100 years ago. And since the early 1970s, even though we've had booming decades in the 80s and 90s, overall, our growth rates since we went off the Bretton Woods system, the old gold standard, in 1971, the U.S. average growth rates are less than they were before 1971. And if we'd maintained the growth rates that we had for 180 years up to 1971, if we'd maintained those growth rates after 1971, on average, the U.S. economy today would be 50% larger than it is now. 40 years compounding, in effect reverse compounding, adds up to a lot. Just savor for a moment having 50% higher incomes, what it would mean for the deficit, what it would mean for Social Security, what it would mean for a lot of the social divisions today. This thing over time adds up. It's a critical reason why it takes 2 incomes in a family to do what 1 income could in previous generations. Obviously, taxes are a large part of it, but the debasement of the dollar since the early 70s is a critical part of it as well. And when this thing happens, when you don't have a stable currency, you end up with people not getting ahead the way they should, median incomes not growing the way they should, and leading, as my co-author Elizabeth will discuss in a few minutes, a fraying of the social fabric, reduction of social trust, and more divisions. And as Keynes said, it's a process that not 1 in a million will be able to diagnose. And so that's why we wrote the book. Now, since monetary policy doesn't usually get the heart beating a flutter the way some of the reality shows do. I'll begin by just giving you an advance reward, and that is to give you a travel tip. If you ever find yourself in an airplane, in coach, middle seat, on the runway, watching your life pass away, and you want a little bit of elbow room with your seatmates, start talking about monetary policy. They'll cut you a wide berth. So as a result of the chaos that we've had, slow moving for most of the time since the 1970s, the Federal Reserve has gotten up in terms of more and more power. But the thing is, the more power it gets, the worse we are. You take quantitative easing, which I'll discuss in a moment. Even though they're now tapering the thing, which is a good thing, it ended up contracting the economy rather than stimulating the economy. Now, in terms of money, the thing to understand about money, it's very basic. It makes transactions, buying and selling, which is how we improve our standard of living, which is how we exist, makes buying and selling much easier. You know, in the old days, we had barter, which was very inefficient. So let's say I sold an ad in Forbes 3,000 years ago. How would I get paid? Perhaps with a herd of goats. Now I'm being a little facetious here, but let's say I wanted to buy iPads for our writers. So let's say I went to the Apple store 3,000 years ago with my herd of goats. The Apple store owner says, I don't want goats, I want sheep. So I have to figure out how to swap the goats for sheep. And maybe I have to hire a sheep herder because the sheep herder, you don't want the wolves to eat the sheep. The sheep herder wants to be paid in wine. I have red wine, he wants white wine. I mean, it just becomes very efficient. Imagine if we still had barter today. Imagine trying to deposit a cow in an ATM. It just becomes very inefficient. So in essence, what money does, money most of the time does not have intrinsic value unless you have old gold coins and the like. But money makes transactions easier, and in that sense, money measures value. That's all it does. Measures value. The way clocks measure time, scales measure weight, rulers measure length, money measures value. So because it represents value, it makes transactions easier, and in that sense, it's a form of communications. It lets you know information to do all the billions of transactions we do around the world each and every day. So money in and of itself is not wealth, but it represents a claim on products and services. Think of it as you would a coat check. A coat check has no intrinsic value. But in a restaurant, you put your coat in the closet, you get a coat check, it represents a claim on the coat. So the idea that creating money represents products and services that have already been produced. So it would be, so the idea that if we stimulate the economy by printing up money would be like a restaurant saying if we create more coat checks, that'll stimulate the production of more coats. No, it does not. It's a claim. It represents a claim on a product or service, money does. So money works best when it has a fixed value. You know, just like a clock has 60 minutes in an hour. Imagine what the world would be like, your daily life would be like, if the Federal Reserve did to clocks what it does to the dollar. Imagine floating the clock. So you have 60 minutes an hour one day, 48 minutes the next, 22 minutes the next, 80 the next. You'd soon have to have hedges and derivatives and futures to figure out how many hours you're working each day. Let's say you're baking a cake. It says, bake the batter 45 minutes. You have to figure out, now is that inflation-adjusted minutes, real minutes? I mean, it just makes life much more difficult. Imagine what would happen if they changed the number of inches in a foot. You're building a bridge, and suddenly you learn that instead of 12 inches, the foot's now 10 inches. Imagine building a house. Just makes things much more chaotic. So money works best when it has a fixed value. And then the question becomes, what's the best way to do it? And even though it's absolutely out of fashion still in the economics profession, the way it worked in this country for our first 180 years of existence is you fix it to GOLD, you fix it to gold. Why gold? Because more than anything else in the world, gold keeps its intrinsic value. Has for 4,000 years. You can't destroy it. every ounce that's been mined is still in the world today. It's been pointed out that perhaps the gold ring you're wearing may have certain grains going back to Egyptian pharaohs and Egyptian times. You can't destroy it. It's hard to make, but not too hard, so you don't get too much of it at a time. And because you can't destroy it, if you find a big gold mine, you don't get a glut of gold. Even the California gold rush, which was one of the biggest finds ever, only increased the annual supply about 3 or 4% and then tapered down back to the average of 1.5 or 2%. So unlike wheat, you don't get droughts or things like that. You don't have to worry about storage, about mice eating the gold. So whether you freeze it or heat it or beat it up, you can't destroy it. It's got very unique properties. So it stood the test of time for 4,000 years. Now people think if you mention gold that, oh, does that mean we have to have gold coins and you have to have 100% backing and all of that? No, think of gold as you would the ruler. It's just a fixed measure of value. So let's say we fix the dollar to gold at $1,200 an ounce. All that would mean is if it went above $1,200 in the marketplace, $1,200 an ounce, that means the Fed's creating too much money, so it creates less money. If it goes below $1,200, it means you've got to create a little more money. So it lets the marketplace determine the needs of what's needed in terms of money. So if you have a vibrant economy, you're going to create more money. You don't have to own an ounce of gold to do it. The British ran it, classical gold standard, with very, very little amount of gold. But they knew what they were doing, and they responded to signals in the marketplace, and it worked right up into World War I, which blasted that and a lot of other things. So gold in that sense is like the ruler. The fact that a mile has 5,280 feet does not restrict the number of miles of highway you build. So just to give you one little factoid that you can use at a cocktail party to show how brilliant you are, from the time of our existence, go back to the Revolutionary War in 1775 when we were a small agricultural nation, we up to, say, 1900, when our population increased 25-fold, we went from a small ag nation to the mightiest industrial nation in the world. During that period of time, the amount of gold mined in the world went up only 3.5-fold. The money supply in the U.S. went up 160-fold, even though the dollar was fixed to gold. So gold just makes sure the value stays fixed. It does not restrict the supply. If you have a vibrant economy, it meets the needs of the marketplace. If you have a stagnant economy, you don't create it. So it's very, very, very basic. And so when people lose sight of that, when you end up having what we've had since 1971. We lurched from one crisis to another. We had a terrible decade in the 70s. We got it semi-right in the 80s and 90s, and boy, we moved ahead. But in the last decade, we went backwards. And starting, and this is not a partisan thing, started under the Bush administration, Treasury Department, Federal Reserve started to weaken the dollar. They thought that would stimulate exports. And that's how we got the housing bubble. Anytime you undermine the integrity of a dollar, the dollar, people go into hard assets. From the mid-1980s to the early part of last decade, the average price of a barrel of oil was a little over $21 a barrel. What is it today? 80, 90, 100? Mideast crisis may knock it up to 110. Back in the 70s, none of you are old enough to remember the 70s. Yeah, it's called pandering. Tried it in politics, didn't work, which is why I'm peddling books now. But back in the 1970s, oil, went from $3 a barrel last time we went off the rails to almost $40. Everyone thought we're running out of oil and going to go up to $100. Then Reagan came in with Paul Volcker. They killed the terrible inflation of the 70s. Oil went crashing down to $10 a barrel, then averaged $20 to $25 a barrel. So it's like putting a virus in the computer. If you don't trust the value of money, what it means is you get less investment. Investment is less productive because you buy existing things rather than things in the future. Investing is risky enough, but if you don't know whether you're going to get back a 100-cent dollar for a factory that may not pay off for 5 years or 7 years, whether you get back a 100-cent dollar, 80-cent dollar, 20-cent dollar, that adds more uncertainty, which is why we've been stagnant, dead in the water by our historic standards. So that's why we wrote the book Money. Educate about money. Money represents value. Gold is the best way to fix that value. And if we understand that, then we can move ahead and get back the kind of growth rates we had before 1971. Obviously, there are a lot of other things we have to do, but experience shows us that if you don't get the money right in terms of a fixed value, you can get other things right. You can get the taxes right, the spending right, the regulations right. But if you don't get the money right, it's going to undermine everything else, because it's the basis of everything else. Basis of transactions, basis of trust, basis of investment. And because when it works, we don't realize what makes it work. It's like air. When it's clean, we take it for granted. When we have pollution, oh my goodness, air is important. Yes. So the money is in the same way. And one aspect of money that gets overlooked, because we always focus when we think of money on economics and GDP and the like, is social trust. And we have a chapter which Elizabeth is going to discuss for a few moments, a chapter talking about how debasing money debases society, undermines the social fabric, and ways that go beyond simply GDP numbers and exchange numbers. So I'll call up Elizabeth, but one thing to keep in mind is when money is stable in value, brain power goes for a productive use. And just one example, before 1971, when currencies didn't much fluctuate because we were fixed to gold, very little currency trading. Now currency trading is a huge activity all around the world. Daily volume over $3 trillion. Tens of thousands of the best brains in the world focused on an activity that would not exist if we had stable money, brain power that could be used for medical research, other things, productive things. So this thing has consequences that go beyond merely GDP and QE and whatever other acronyms they throw out. With that, let me say thank you and turn it over to my colleague Elizabeth. Thank you.
Good evening. It's good to be here. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that chapter, Chapter 5, which is Money and Morality, How Debasing Money Debases Society. And people have found this chapter particularly thought-provoking in money. It starts out with that quote that Steve mentioned, a famous quote from the economist John Maynard Keynes, and I'll read it in its entirety. Lenin was certainly right. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and it does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose. And we say in the book that unstable money is a little bit like carbon monoxide. It's odorless and colorless. And you don't know the damage it's doing until it's very nearly too late. And that's because people are really not always aware when governments weaken their currency, and they only see the effects of it, which is one reason why debasing money is so corrosive. And people say money is about greed, but in fact it's about trust. Money permits strangers from all nations and societies, from all walks of life, to come together and conduct transactions based on a commonly agreed upon measure of value. Money in this way promotes cooperation between people. It serves as an instrument of communication as well. It tells us what a society values, not just materially, but what its priorities are. So when money is corrupted, its ability to act as a facilitator of trust and cooperation is corrupted as well. Unstable, debased money undermines the vital relationships between buyer and seller, between lender and debtor. The philosopher John Locke described this fissure that is produced at society's core, and he wrote, and you've also probably heard this as well, whether the creditor be forced to receive less or the debtor be forced to pay more than his contract, the damage and injury is the same whenever a man is defrauded of his due. And during periods of unstable money, you often see a particular scenario unfold. Scapegoating involves scapegoating, corruption, social unrest, and often increasingly coercive government. And in the worst cases, it can unleash the forces of political extremism that can lead to the rise of dictators. And recently, an investment strategist named Dylan Grice wrote a particularly good piece describing this classic scenario that's occurred throughout history. And he points out that monetary debasement has coincided not only with the persecution of the Jews in pre-World War II Germany, but also with the French Revolution's reign of terror, the Salem witch trials, and other bloody episodes through the centuries. But this kind of destruction of trust and unrest is not just a remote historical occurrence, it's taking place in many areas of the world today, such as the Middle East, Europe, and to a certain extent the US. ETM Analytics, a South African investment advisory house, has issued reports called riot alerts, which predict the world's most likely trouble spots. And the firm has been able to forecast unrest based on nations' rates of monetary abuse. And Syria, which has suffered nearly 200% hyperinflation, topped the list in February of 2013, followed by Argentina, South Africa, Egypt, India, and Turkey, all of which have been inflators. Of course, there are political causes for this unrest, and it takes different forms in different countries, but unstable money in all cases has been a catalyst. And the riots that began in the Arab Spring, for example, you may remember started over increasing food prices. The financial crisis was very much a Lockean betrayal of trust. Weak money helped create a housing bubble, and then the Fed pulled the rug out from under borrowers, and this led to ultimately the collapse of some financial a wave of foreclosures, which led to the collapse of major financial institutions, and it triggered the stock market meltdown of 2008, and then that in turn set off a worldwide destruction of trust that ricocheted from one continent to the next. In Europe, bank failures and bailouts shook the confidence of global investors, helping bring on the sovereign debt crisis over there. And we all remember those days, and I will read a quote from an economist from Deutsche Bank who told the New York Times, "In this day and age, a bank run spreads around the world, not around the block. Once a bank run is underway, it doesn't matter anymore if you have good loans or bad loans. People lose confidence in you." So that's really obviously shows that this is really about trust. And this worldwide loss of trust very quickly turned to rage, riots and protests, and we say in the book it went from balance sheets to the streets. And in 2012, there was a poll by the Pew Research Center that we cite in the book. It said that Americans have been more polarized now than at any other time during the past 20 years. And what they basically said, most of this increased polarization has taken place not just in the last few years, but during the presidencies of both George Bush and Barack Obama, and both administrations were weak dollar administrations. So there was definitely this polarization has coincided with the weakening of money. When money is weakened, there's a sense of increasing unfairness, that the system is rigged, that you're being defrauded. People on fixed incomes, on salaries, see their money losing value, while other people are reaping what look like artificially unfair windfall gains. And the link between effort and reward is severed. And that's why in economies with unstable currency, you get more corruption and crime. And a number of studies have found that inflation actually has a stronger connection to crime than joblessness. Crime rates, in fact, in the U.S. dropped immediately after the financial crisis when there was a serious deflation, but they began to move up in 2010 during quantitative easing, which is sort of an interesting thing that we say in the book. And these are just a few highlights from the chapter. And both left and right agree today that this is a period of malaise, but we hope this book helps people put aside some of the finger-pointing that's been taking place in recent years and helps them recognize the role of the unstable dollar as the catalyst and culprit. Thank you.
We now come to Q&A. As Brad said, if you could come up to the microphone if you have a question. and feel free to ask away.
Yeah, I guess rather than trying to debate you on any of the ideas here of the concept of stable money and so forth, I guess I would just ask this: why is it that so many countries, including the United States, have dropped the gold standard, and why is this sort of theory so unpopular, and why is it? You mentioned the fact that, or you gave the quote from Keynes, who said 1 in a million will correctly diagnose the problem. So that's kind of a hint that there's some basic fundamental reason why it's hard for people to understand this, and for other economists or whatever to sort of accept the theory. Why do you believe that there are so relatively few economists that accept your proposal?
The reason that the gold standard lost the dominance that it had in terms of intellectual circles was a result of two catastrophes. One was the First World War, which began 100 years ago this year, destroyed the classical gold standard. And after that war, because the standard had worked so well, they didn't really realize what made it work. And so Britain did not do it right, going back to it. That led to, for example, after the war, they tried to ignore the inflation that the First World War created, and try to repeg gold to its pre-war price, which is ridiculous. If you've doubled or tripled your money supply, recognize you had a one-time catastrophe and do a revaluation. They didn't do it, so they harmed their economy that way. Keynes came along, and others who turned classical economics. This sounds a little arcane, but it's very basic. Classical economists said the real economy is the production of products and services. The money economy is the symbol economy, a symbol of products and services. Keynes reversed that and said money is the real driver of the economy, and it is the production of products and services that respond to the money. So he reversed it. He put the cart before the horse. And so they got up with the idea that if you print up money, that can stimulate the economy. It'll certainly stimulate activity, but all it does is go into activities that normally would not happen, like the oil boom that we've had in the last 10 years, the oil boom that we had in the 70s, the housing bubble that we had. We had a housing surge in the 70s, not the catastrophe this time because the government wasn't quite as involved in it. But you would get it's like putting the virus in the computer. You get activity, but it's false activity. And in the 1980s, you had energy go through a depression, agriculture went through a depression, commercial real estate went through a huge hit. We grew in the 80s, but a lot of activities that thrived under false and funny money had to be liquidated in the 80s. And you saw it with housing today. And who knows if we get stable money, what other things are false investments we've had out there. So it was World War I and then the Great Depression. Nobody knew why the Depression came. It was something like a bolt out of the blue, and they were desperate for solutions. We explain in the book the Depression was triggered by a hideous trade war that we triggered with the Smoot-Hawley tariff. We blew up the global trading system. Everyone retaliated. Then every country made it worse by massively raising taxes. For example, in the Depression, as the Depression was ongoing in the U.S., we raised the top income tax rate overnight, Hoover did, from 25% to 63%. Excise taxes, which are sort of a sales tax, were enacted on numerous items, and including a stamp tax on checks. If in the early 30s you wrote a check to pay a bill, you had to pay a tax to the government for using a check. So these massive tax increases came in the U.S., in Britain. Germany went berserk on new taxes, so they deepened the downturn. So then they said, well, gosh, let's try funny money. So the Brits started it by devaluing the pound, numerous other countries. And so one bad thing was done after the other. Despite that experience, we still got a gold standard after the war. The Bretton Woods system, designed in 1944, worked perfectly well, but by then, the idea of using monetary policy to guide an economy, using the government to guide the economy, was so prevalent that they didn't know how to preserve the system, which is why we blew it up in 1971 gratuitously. And we've been floundering ever since. As I mentioned, in the 80s and 90s, gold averaged roughly $350 an ounce. It was, had some fluctuations, but give it a C plus for monetary policy. And so we got growth from it, but it was still not what we could have done. And then in the early part of the last decade, we went off the rails again, and we still haven't dug ourselves out of that one. So two catastrophes, World War I, Great Depression, but now it's beginning to reverse. It's still below the radar screen, but a growing number of thinkers are saying, hey, maybe this funny money, which was tried before Adam Smith came along, he demolished the idea of funny money. Maybe Smith had it right. Maybe we should re-examine things again. So this is what the book is contributing to, getting back to basics on money, getting the conversation going so we can get back on track again. And so the Federal Reserve, if it's doing its job right, should be no more important than the Bureau of Weights and Measures inside the Commerce Department. And by the way, if you ever run into a Federal Reserve official, ask them, in terms of assuming powers by the Fed, ask them, they say they want 2.5% inflation because they believe that creating extra money stimulates the economy. That translates to a typical family an extra $1,000 a year of expenses. Ask them, who gave you the authority to tax an American family an extra $1,000 a year? And why does paying that extra $1,000 a year stimulate economic activity? I'd love to hear what I've asked it, but I haven't gotten an answer. Yes.
Well, it just seems that even though I believe you're correct that something's wrong with the money, I don't think it's a broad enough discussion both to really cover what's happening to us economically. It's so much more sophisticated now than it was that I believe your analysis going. A few things I'll throw at you. The value of gold changes. It fluctuates a great deal. A lot of the value of gold was artificially created by legislating it as the center of the value of money. So it had the reverse effect too. In other words, but I mean, there are times in our history when we haven't had enough money, we had to expand. I mean, there were panics in the 1800s. But the point is, isn't there in your thinking some more broader concept of the distribution of wealth and income? And I mean, it just seems too simplified in this complicated situation that we're in.
Well, if the key thing is to recognize money is a measure of value, just like a clock is a measure of time. And if you grasp that, then you see that gold does not influence the money supply. It just makes sure that when a dollar is created in the marketplace, it has a fixed value. Now, to take your point on the fluctuating price of gold, that is less about the intrinsic value of gold and more about the market's valuing of the U.S. dollar now and fears or hopes for the future. So when people felt the world was coming to an end in 2011, you remember debt crisis, default, and everything else, gold shot up to 1900. The world did not come to an end, so now it's about 12 or 1300. In 1980, it looked like the world was coming to an end, and it quickly shot up from $300 to $870 an ounce before going back down again after the election of Reagan. So that's more about the perceptions of the value of currencies than it is about the intrinsic value of gold. As for legislating a value, the reason gold rose up was not bankers getting together and saying, let's do this. It rose up out of the marketplace. Coins in Lydia and in Athens rose out of the marketplace. Governments quickly went into the minting business, couldn't keep their hands off of it, but money rose out of the needs of the marketplace, people doing transactions with each other. So it was a spontaneous thing. And what Isaac Newton did 300 years ago with Britain and gold was to, in effect, codify what people thought needed to be done. The Dutch had done it. Holland, for example, in the 1600s, small country under constant attack from Spain, lousy land. I mean, they're underwater, literally. That's why they have dikes. A small population, but because of its sound money, led to rise of sophisticated capital markets, and with the guilder, they became the financial center of the world before London did, even though on paper, this country had nothing. Britain became the financial center when it fixed to gold, even though it was a second-tier power before they did this. They had a lot of other things going for it, but having stable money brought it all together. So the marketplace has said over 4,000 years, this is the way to do it. And as a result, economies always get more complex as you get more and more growth. That's what Adam Smith talked about, the division of labor. And jobs rise up. I mean, no one, if you said apps a few years ago, is that short for applications for college? I mean, what are you talking about? If you said iPod, is that a remake of a movie about monsters from the iPod people? So things rise up that you can't even imagine. So again, it's just a fixed measure of value, makes measuring transactions the way we improve our standard of living, more and more trading, more and more specialization where we can focus on what we do best, so we don't have to spend all our time growing food or hunting mastodons or things to survive. We can focus on what we're best at. That's what you get with fixed money. You can do those things more easily. Yes, sir.
Given the seeming dependence of the economy, particularly the markets, on the Fed's monetary policy and their willingness to create money whenever they feel like it, billions at a time, what does a return to the gold standard look like for the markets and for the street?
Well, I think that if we decide to do it, and I think we will, I hope it's not a result of a crisis, but a result of people saying we've been drifting on and off for 40 years. We're not doing what we did historically. Let's start it. And by the way, there's a congressman, Representative Brady, Kevin Brady, who's proposed a commission, bipartisan, to examine monetary policy. And I think that's a good start to get the debate going. And but going on a gold standard, well, all it would mean, what it would mean over time, is you would have a much bigger economy. If we went back,
crash the market?
No. There's a lot of myths, and we discuss them in the book. A lot of myths. The question was, would it crash the market? No. There's a lot of myths about gold, that it causes deflation and bad times for farmers and all this kind of thing. No. What it does is allow the humankind to surge forward. And the changes you get in the economy, it was not gold that led to hard-pressed agriculture. It's the fact that we learned to grow more food. And we're still learning to grow more food. I mean, just take corn, for example. Just popped in my mind, corn. Right now, typically, in the 30s, a typical acre of corn produced 27 bushels. Today, it's 150. And we wrote about a fellow, Harry Stein, in Iowa, who's now about to invent breakthroughs in corn that are going to lead to 300 or 400 bushels per acre. So agriculture today, 2% of our economy. 100 years ago, it was about 60 or 70%. Railroads, for example. After World War II, railroads employed 1.2 million people. Today, they employ less than 200,000 and carry about 10 times as much freight. So economies are always adjusting. But the key thing is you want it to be adjusting upward rather than what we have now, where it's stagnation and people wondering, am I going to get ahead? Is my 50-year-old son ever going to leave the house? I mean, Yes, sir.
Mr. Forbes, thanks for coming out. Like you, I'm probably part of the minority who agrees with the sound money principles, but unfortunately, I can't really afford gold at all. Right now, it's like about, $1,600 for a coin. I always carry silver with me, though, an ounce of silver. And I'm kind of weird like that. But anyway, this is a 1923 dollar. It's worth about $20 today. And the two most interesting things I've realized when, after learning over the past 2 or 3 years about, gold, silver, and all that stuff, is that you can buy the same amount of gasoline today with this dollar as you could have before 1964. And and I guess before 1964, all quarters, dimes, half dollars, and dollars were made out of 90% silver. And that was just like a mind-blowing fact that this, although this is still $1, you know, you go to a coin shop, it's worth $20 because it's made out of silver. You sell this dollar for $20 and you go out with your $20 bill, you can buy the same amount of gasoline, 4 to 5 gallons, as you could have in 1964. So what that tells you is that the price of gas has stayed constant in relation to gold and silver, whereas the price today of gasoline rose not because the price of gas necessarily rose, because your purchasing power of the dollar has gone down. And the second most interesting, mind-blowing fact that I've learned is that 10 dimes is exactly the same weight as this quarter, and 10 dimes is exactly the same weight as this silver dollar, and 4 quarters is exactly the same weight as this silver dollar, and 2 half dollars is the same weight as this dollar. So, you know, before, your dimes are smaller than your quarters for a reason. 2.5 dimes is the same weight as a quarter. So I'm just, you talk a lot about gold, so I guess my question is, where do you see silver playing, coming into the picture of your ideal society?
Well, in terms of ideal society, no, society's never ideal with human beings. But going back, in essence, going forward, doing in essence what we did for our first 180 years of existence, from George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, who fixed the dollar to gold, right up until Nixon blew it up in 1971 with the applause of most economists and so-called experts. Apropos of your point on gasoline, just go back 13 years, 12 years before we went off the rails again, big time instead of small time. A gallon of gasoline was $1. Imagine what life would be like today if you could pay $1 for a gallon of gasoline. That was only 12 years ago. Now what is it, 3.5, 4, depending on the part of the country you're in. In terms of silver, for centuries, gold and silver were roughly had the same relationship. 15 ounces of silver was usually worth 1 ounce of gold, 15, 16 ounces. But what happened in the 1870s, starting in the 1870s, was that people started to use more and more paper money. Small coins were convenient, starting with Hamilton, wanted small coins so people could get accustomed to a money economy. But with the rise of paper, you didn't need coins as much. And so the demand for silver fell. So by the mid-1890s it was 30 to 1. Today it's about 60 to 1. So in that sense, gold is held up better than silver. But your point that the money had a constant value and that certain things like oil or your gallon of gasoline have remained constant. And you make a very, very, very fundamental point. A lot of what we think of as rising costs, like energy, is really the devaluation of the dollar and fears of future devaluations of the dollar. It's a very good point. And by the way, with that silver dollar you have, if you flip it on this table, you'll hear a nice loud sound. That's how we got the phrase sound money.
I'll do one more for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Forbes. What are your thoughts on the concentration in the banking industry, the consolidation and the concentration of deposits?
The question is, what about the consolidation of the banking industry? It's one thing to get consolidation as a result of natural forces of the marketplace. You get efficiencies and the like. Quite another when it's a result of regulation and fiat. And in the first part of our history, we had a lot of extra banks because of regulation, not because of the nature. Politicians wouldn't allow banks to combine. When Bank of America, the original Bank of America back in the 1920s, started in California by a fellow named A.P. Giannini. And when he took the bank across state lines, using a bank holding company to get around restrictions that if you had a bank in one state, you're not allowed to own a bank in another. And so he had a bank holding company. Congress passed an act to stop him from doing it. So once upon a time we had too many. Today, Dodd-Frank had the implicit purpose of driving small banks out of business. And the reason they're doing it, you talk to a small bank today and they'll tell you it's not the economy that's killing them, it's regulation that's killing them. The reason they're trying to do that is that big is easier for government to control than a lot of small entities out there. That's why they make it impossible, by the way, for single practitioners in healthcare. You spend 90% of your time filling out forms instead of practicing medicine. They don't like you to be having so many doctors out there. They want you to be part of a collective in a hospital or a big company. Easier to control, easier to regulate. So that's what's happening now. What you're seeing now, that consolidation is as much artificial as more than it is the nature of changing marketplaces. And the other danger of the Fed's grasping of power, they're now putting their claws in the insurance industry. After the elections, they're going to go after mutual funds, money funds, equity funds, hedge funds, anything that moves, they're going after to reduce risk. What it means is when you reduce risk the way they want to do it is you're going to get no innovation. They never would have allowed 40 years ago the rise of money funds when in those days they regulated what banks could pay for interest in those days, and money funds blew that up. So it's a bad thing, and it's coming about by fiat rather than by nature. And that's a bad thing because one of the virtues we have in this country is our vibrant and innovative capital markets. They went off the rails in the last few years because the Fed went off the rails. But over history, we've always developed numerous ways for people to get capital. By contrast, in Europe, it's all bank-oriented, which is why they get very few new big companies, because they don't have a system that nurtures companies from being babies through adolescence, mezzanine financing, the like, so they become big and go public. They don't have it. And just one statistics, what they call commercial industrial loans in this country, banks lending commercial industrial loans, about $1.5 trillion. In Europe, the equivalent number, when you take Europe together, it's about the same population, a little bigger less than when you add up all their economies, about 4.8 trillion. They're way over dependent on banks, which is a very fragile, suffocating, and dangerous system. So you bring up a good point. We don't want to go that way. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for the stimulation. I want to go to the core of your argument and ask you whether, in fact, you're not forgetting the way people really are. So I've not read the book, so you will forgive me for simplifying. But basically,
we can cure that. We'll
yeah, well, maybe, yes, hopefully. You're developing the old, to some extent, moralistic argument that inflation is bad. And of course, everybody has heard about the historical development in Germany in the 1930s and the way inflation has indeed destroyed the fabric of society. But things don't always work that way. People dream, people do foolish things. Go to the history of Southern European countries. You will see, a lot of dreams. And constantly look at the past 50 years of economic history. Devaluation is a way to bring things in order, bring them back without upheaval. So to some extent, one could strongly develop the argument that, in fact, it's the contrary of what you're saying. It is rigor that for certain society destroys the fabric of society. There has to be some mechanism by which you have you allow dreams, but then you have an adjustment at some point in time. So that's the way people are.
Yeah.
Aren't you forgetting it?
A gold standard is not going to change human nature. That's not going to change, period. And utopian societies only try to change human nature by ending up crushing people, killing them. So it doesn't change human nature. So you're always going to get, like in the early part of the last century, everyone realized automobiles were a big thing. We had about the creation of 2,000 to 3,000 auto manufacturers. How many of them survived? You can count them on your fingers. Some of you old enough to may remember the early 80s when we had the first PC boom. Then you got a shakeout there. Apple, Apple survived, but Atari, Commodore, Texas Instruments, others who were in the business went by the wayside. That is normal. The market always, that's how you move ahead. You don't know what's going to work until you try it. And then 15 years ago, no one would have, Google was once, I think, a number. And so these two kids challenged Microsoft in search and beat them at it. Now they're the big bad guys, Google. So this is constant. All gold standard does, is make sure that money has a stable value. It does not prevent people from getting giddy. It does not prevent people from getting depressed. It just makes sure that when you do a transaction, the money is fixed in value. Just like when you order a gallon of gasoline, you assume it's a gallon. It's not 2/3 of a gallon or 1.3 gallons. You know what you're getting. But in terms of the rest of human nature, but what it does do, because it has a stable value, is you do get more risk-taking. You do get more people investing in the future. Most don't make it, but that's how you find out what works and doesn't work, is that constant experimentation in the marketplace and even failures. Remember, Henry Ford had 2 painful bankruptcies and almost a third before he figured out how to make a car that could sell. Trial and error, and that's what you want. But if you don't have that stable money, then things stay the same. Yes, sir. Oh. Okay.
2 short questions. What was Nixon faced with in '71 that he felt pressure? What is he trying to do that he felt he had to resort to the getting out of the gold standard? And number 2, gold has had increasing industrial uses. It's going up geometrically, and we all know about the uses of it in space, and it's a good electricity conductor, and more uses are being found for it. How will this affect? What will happen to? How will this affect things? What effect will the gold standard have on that?
First question: what happened in 1971 that forced us off the gold standard? Supposedly, because we weren't playing by the rules under the Bretton Woods system. $35 an ounce. Nixon was worried about re-election. The economy wasn't, he thought, responding quickly enough, and so the theory was out there that if you devalue the dollar, that'll boost exports, which will help the economy, boost the economy, and everyone will be happy. And for a year in 1972, they put in wage price controls, devalued the dollar, and for a year it worked, and he got reelected, and then the economy crashed. So it was a bad intellectual theory that brought it about, not any real crisis. Any of the economic problems we had in the 50s, 60s, small beer compared to some of the crises we had in the past. There was no ostensible reason to do it. And in terms of industrial uses of gold, it's a small fraction of the amount out there. In fact, we're probably using less gold for things. In fact, we don't use gold anymore for fillings in our teeth. Once upon a time, we had gold and silver in our teeth. So we don't use that. So in terms of most gold is for store of value and ornament. There has some industrial uses, but nothing that would say, oh my goodness, we need all the 5.5 billion ounces for 6 billion ounces for industrial uses. It's too valuable to use. That's why we don't wear it in our teeth anymore. We found cheaper and better ways to fix our teeth. Any other questions? If not, thank you all very much, and we'll go to the signing. Thank you.